In the deepest chambers beneath the mountains of Morrowind, where the ancient stones still hold the warmth of 1,000 forgotten forges, there lies a mystery so profound that it has haunted scholars for centuries. Picture, if you will, the moment when an entire civilization simply ceased to exist, not through war, not through plague, not through any catastrophe known to mortal understanding, but through something far more extraordinary. One moment, the great halls of the Dwemer echoed with the gentle rhythm of their hammers and the soft whisper of their steam-powered mechanisms. The next moment, silence, complete, absolute, eternal silence. But this is not merely a tale of disappearance. This is the story of the greatest mystery Tamriel has ever known, a puzzle that bridges the gap between the mortal and the divine, between the mechanical and the magical, between what is and what could be. For the Dwemer did not simply vanish, they transcended, and the secret of how they achieved this impossible feat lies waiting in the very stones of their abandoned cities. Deep within the heart of Red Mountain, in chambers that few living souls have ever seen, there stands a device of such incredible complexity that even the wisest mages cannot fully comprehend its purpose. Ancient Dwemer texts speak of it in whispers, calling it the tools of Kagrenac, instruments of power that could reshape the very foundations of reality itself. And at the center of their greatest experiment lay something that should not exist in mortal hands, the Heart of Lorkhan, the divine essence of a dead god, still beating with the power of creation itself. The Dwemer, those enigmatic children of stone and steam, had spent centuries studying this heart, learning its secrets, understanding its power. They were not the stern, bearded warriors that Nord legends describe, but gentle philosophers and brilliant engineers who spoke to metal as others speak to friends. Their society was built not on conquest but on understanding, not on domination but on harmony with the fundamental forces that govern existence. In their final days, as their great work neared completion, strange phenomena began to manifest throughout their cities. The very air hummed with anticipation, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Steam vents released vapors that carried impossible scents. Mechanical devices began to sing in harmonies that had never been programmed. And the Dwemer themselves spoke increasingly of unity, of transcendence, of becoming something greater than the sum of their individual parts. And then, in a single moment that lasted both an instant and an eternity, they made their choice. To understand the magnitude of what the Dwemer achieved, we must first journey into their world as it was in those final fateful days. Imagine descending through the ancient entrance shafts that still pierce the mountainsides of Morrowind, following passages carved with mathematical precision into the living rock. The air grows warmer as you descend, heated by the elaborate network of steam pipes that the Dwemer use to bring comfort to their underground realm. Soft light emanates from soul gems embedded in the walls at regular intervals, casting everything in a warm amber glow that seems to pulse gently, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Their cities were marvels of engineering that surpassed anything the surface world had ever imagined. Great halls stretched for hundreds of yards, their ceilings supported by columns that seemed to grow from the floor like metal trees. But these were not crude excavations. These were spaces designed by minds that understood both the practical needs of a thriving civilization and the deeper harmonies that exist between architecture and consciousness. Every curve served a purpose. Every angle had been calculated not just for structural integrity, but for acoustic properties that would carry sound in pleasing patterns throughout the living spaces. The workshops were places of quiet contemplation, where the gentle tap of hammers against metal created rhythms that seemed to match the deeper rhythms of the earth itself. Master craftsmen worked alongside eager apprentices, not in relationships of domination, but in partnerships of shared discovery. Tools were arranged with careful precision, each in its perfect place, creating an atmosphere of calm order that spoke to their deep understanding of harmony and balance. The very air in these spaces carried the scent of heated metal and careful oils, the perfume of a people who found beauty in the precise function of well-made mechanisms. But the Dwemer were far more than mere craftsmen. They were philosophers who worked with their hands, thinkers who found truth in the precise movement of gears and the steady flow of steam. While other races looked to the stars or to their gods for answers, the Dwemer looked inward to the mechanisms of existence itself, to the quiet laws that governed reality at its most fundamental level. Their society was built on principles of cooperation and shared knowledge that other races found difficult to understand. There were no kings among the Dwemer, no priests or nobles. Instead, their communities resembled vast workshops where everyone contributed their unique skills to the greater understanding. Their approach to the divine was particularly unique. Where other races worshipped, the Dwemer studied. Where others prayed, they experimented. Where others feared the gods, the Dwemer sought to understand them as they would understand any other mechanism of existence. This was not irreverence born of arrogance, but scholarly fascination, driven by the same gentle curiosity they applied to all aspects of the world around them. They believed that the gods themselves operated according to discoverable principles, and that these principles could be understood through patient observation and careful experimentation. Their daily lives were marked by routines that others might mistake for mere habit, but which were actually rituals of discovery. Each morning brought new questions, new mechanisms to understand, new aspects of reality to explore with their characteristic patience and precision. They gathered in small groups to share their findings, discussing their discoveries with the same careful attention that they gave to the crafting of their finest mechanisms. Knowledge flowed freely among them, like the heated water that flowed through the channels carved into their city floors. Yet even in their most peaceful moments, there were signs of the great transformation that was approaching. In their quiet conversations, they spoke increasingly of the heart, the divine artifact that had become the focus of their deepest studies. Their mechanical devices grew more sophisticated with each passing year, more attuned to forces that existed at the very foundations of reality. The gentle rhythm of their daily lives began to synchronize around a greater purpose, as if all their individual discoveries were notes in a vast symphony that was approaching its crescendo. They spoke of unity with growing frequency, of understanding that would finally solve the greatest puzzle of all, the nature of existence itself. And as their great work neared completion, the very stones of their cities seemed to resonate with anticipation, as if the mountains themselves were preparing for a transformation that would echo through the ages. As the seasons turned like pages in an ancient tome, the inhabitants of the surface settlements that bordered Dwemer territories began to notice subtle changes in the familiar rhythms that had provided a constant, comforting backdrop to their lives. The soft percussion of metalworking that had echoed from the depths for as long as anyone could remember began to shift in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Where once there had been the scattered individual sounds of hundreds of workshops operating independently, now there emerged something different, a more unified rhythm, as if the entire Dwemer civilization was gradually synchronizing their work to some greater unseen pattern. The Redguard merchants who had traded with the Dwemer for generations were among the first to notice these changes. During their regular journeys to the mountain trading posts, they found their usual Dwemer contacts increasingly preoccupied, though not with distraction or worry. Instead, there was a quality of focused attention about them, the intense concentration of scholars who sense they are approaching a long-sought answer. Conversations that once ranged freely across topics of philosophy, mechanical innovation, and the simple pleasures of craftsmanship now centered increasingly on references to something they called the great work, spoken of in tones that mixed reverence with scientific excitement. The very air around the Dwemer territories began to carry new qualities. Steam emerged from vents in the mountainsides that had never released vapor before, carrying with it scents that were both familiar and strange. The usual metallic tang of their workshops was still present, But now it was accompanied by something that reminded observers of the charged atmosphere that follows a summer thunderstorm, or the peculiar clarity that fills the air just before dawn breaks over a peaceful landscape. Travelers reported that breathing this air produced a sense of heightened awareness, as if their minds were being gently stimulated by some invisible force. Most remarkably, the quality of light emanating from the Dwemer installations began to change. The warm amber glow of their soul gem illumination systems took on deeper, richer hues that seemed to pulse in slow, meditative rhythms at certain times of day, particularly during the quiet hours just before dawn. This light would intensify and shift through spectrums of color that had no names in any mortal language. Those who witnessed these displays described them not as mere illumination, but as visual music, patterns of light that seemed to tell stories or convey meanings that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to something deeper within the observer's consciousness. The mechanical sounds from the depths began to include entirely new elements that defied easy categorization. Alongside the familiar rhythms of hammers and the gentle hiss of steam, there emerged tones that seemed less like the product of tools working metal and more like the singing of vast crystal formations responding to some unheard melody. These sounds carried a quality of anticipation that was almost palpable, as if the very stones of the mountains were holding their breath in expectation of some momentous but fundamentally peaceful revelation. Within the Dwemer cities themselves, the inhabitants moved through these changes with the calm attention of natural philosophers observing a carefully planned experiment approaching its crucial phase. Their daily gatherings took on a quality of quiet excitement that was entirely different from the frantic energy that might grip other peoples facing the unknown. This was the peaceful anticipation of minds that had worked patiently toward understanding for generations and now felt themselves approaching the culmination of their efforts. The Dwemer began to speak of dreams that seemed to be shared among them, visions of mechanisms vast beyond normal imagination, of understanding that would transform not just their knowledge but their very nature as conscious beings. These dreams were not the chaotic fantasies that trouble ordinary sleep, but coherent, detailed glimpses of possibilities that their conscious minds were only beginning to grasp. They discussed these visions with the same analytical interest that they brought to any mysterious phenomenon, documenting similarities, comparing details, and seeking to understand what these shared experiences might reveal about the work they were approaching. Their ancient texts were consulted with renewed intensity, but not with the desperate urgency of people seeking salvation from catastrophe. Instead, there was a sense of scholars finally having sufficient knowledge to understand writings that had previously been beyond their comprehension. Passages that had puzzled generations of readers suddenly revealed their meanings, as if the approaching culmination of their work was providing a key that unlocked previously hidden layers of understanding. Research that had been conducted independently by different groups for centuries began to converge in ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. Discoveries made in workshops separated by hundreds of miles proved to complement each other perfectly, as if some invisible force was coordinating their efforts toward a common goal. Master craftsmen found that techniques they had developed in isolation were exactly what their colleagues in distant cities needed to complete their own projects, and these synchronicities multiplied with each passing day. The investigation into what they called the heart of the world became the central focus of every Dwemer community, yet this intensification of effort never devolved into competition or conflict. Instead, it represented the ultimate expression of their cooperative nature, as if their entire civilization was transforming itself into a single vast research project dedicated to understanding the deepest mysteries of existence. Ancient protocols for sharing knowledge were expanded and refined, creating networks of communication that allowed insights discovered in one location to be immediately available to scholars throughout their territory. The very atmosphere within Dwemer cities began to carry a quality of expectation that was both thrilling and deeply peaceful. Visitors from other races reported that simply being in these spaces induced a sense of calm anticipation, as if the environment itself was encouraging the kind of patient, focused thinking that had always characterized Dwemer's scholarship. The air seemed to shimmer with possibilities, filled with an energy that was simultaneously ancient and utterly new. As these gentle changes accumulated like morning dew collecting on the leaves of some vast, invisible tree, the Dwemer prepared for what they had come to understand would be their greatest achievement. This was not preparation born of fear or desperate hope, but the careful, methodical readiness of scholars who had spent their entire civilization approaching a single magnificent question and now sensed that the answer was finally within their reach. The ancient texts spoke in whispers of truths so profound that they could only be approached gradually, like climbers ascending a mountain peak that reveals its full majesty only to those patient enough to make the complete journey. In the deepest archives of the Dwemer cities, illuminated by the steady glow of carefully maintained soul gems, scholars gathered around manuscripts that detailed their ancestors' first encounters with the artifact that had become the center of their entire civilization's purpose. The Heart of Lorkhan, the divine essence of the god who had sacrificed himself to create the mortal world. These were not the dramatic epics favored by Nord storytellers or the mystical poetry beloved by the Dwemer. Instead, they were careful chronicles of discovery and patient observation that had been accumulated over countless generations of methodical scholarship. Each volume represented decades of meticulous documentation, every observation recorded with the precision that characterized all Dwemer endeavors. The early texts described not a violent discovery or sudden revelation, but a gradual recognition that unfolded like watching the sunrise slowly illuminate a landscape that had always been there, waiting to be seen in the proper light. The first Dwemer to encounter the heart had approached it with their characteristic combination of reverence and scientific curiosity. They understood immediately that they were in the presence of something that operated according to principles beyond normal understanding, yet they refused to be intimidated by its divine nature. Instead, they began the patient work of observation and documentation that would continue for centuries, each generation building upon the careful notes left by those who came before. What emerged from these studies was a picture of the heart not as a mere relic of divine power, but as something far more profound, a kind of cosmic mechanism, a fundamental component in the vast machinery of existence itself. The Dwemer had come to understand that the heart represented a point where the underlying forces that shaped reality could not only be observed but potentially influenced through the proper application of their mechanical arts. It was, in their terms, the ultimate gear in the great mechanism of creation. Their research revealed that the heart responded to certain frequencies and resonated with particular materials in ways that suggested a form of consciousness far more complex than anything found in mortal minds. It seemed to exist in a state of constant communication with forces that extended far beyond the physical realm, maintaining connections to aspects of existence that the Dwemer were only beginning to comprehend. The heart was not simply powerful in the way that a great engine is powerful, but aware in ways that transcended normal definitions of awareness. The deeper their studies progressed, the more the Dwemer discovered connections between the heart and the fundamental principles that governed their own mechanical philosophy. The same mathematical relationships that determined the movement of their gears and the pressure of their steam system seemed to apply to the heart's function, but on a scale that encompassed all of existence. They began to see patterns in the heart's behavior that mirrored the designs of their most sophisticated devices, as if their entire technological tradition had been unconsciously preparing them to understand this ultimate mechanism. Most significantly, they found that their understanding of souls, those individual sparks of consciousness that powered their soul gems and animated their mechanical constructs, was intimately connected to the heart's nature. The heart appeared to represent a kind of universal soul, a consciousness that existed at the level of reality itself rather than within individual beings. If mortal souls were like individual drops of water in a vast ocean, the heart seemed to be the ocean itself, the source from which all consciousness emerged and to which it would ultimately return. This discovery had profound implications for their understanding of identity, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. The Dwemer began to see their mechanical arts not as mere technology, but as a form of communication with this universal consciousness. Every gear they crafted, every steam pipe they installed, every soul gem they attuned was part of a growing dialogue with the fundamental awareness that underlied all reality. Individual Dwemer scholars found themselves experiencing moments of expanded consciousness during their research, brief instances when their personal awareness seemed to merge with something vastly larger than themselves. These experiences were not frightening or overwhelming but deeply peaceful, like a river finally flowing into the sea from which it had originally emerged. They began to understand that their civilization's long tradition of cooperation and shared knowledge had been preparing them for something far greater than they had previously imagined. The texts from this period reveal a growing sense among the Dwemer that they were approaching not just an intellectual breakthrough, but a fundamental transformation of their very nature as conscious beings. They spoke of unity not as a political concept, but as a metaphysical reality, understanding that the boundaries between individual minds were far more fluid than other races assumed. Their workshops became spaces of shared consciousness as much as shared labor, places where the distinction between individual and collective identity began to blur in the most natural and peaceful way imaginable. The heart's influence seemed to grow stronger as their understanding deepened, not in a way that overwhelmed or controlled them, but like a gentle tide that lifts all boats equally. Their research revealed that the heart was not seeking to dominate or transform them against their will, but rather responding to their approach with what could only be described as recognition and welcome. It was as if the universal consciousness that the heart represented had been waiting patiently for a form of mortal awareness, sophisticated enough to understand its true nature and purpose. As their studies progressed, the Dwemer began to realize that they had reached the threshold of a choice that would define not only their own future, but their understanding of what it meant to exist as conscious beings in a universe where individual identity and universal awareness were part of a greater whole. The ancient texts grew increasingly prophetic in their later passages, speaking of transformation and transcendence not as abstract possibilities, but as an approaching reality that their entire civilization had been unconsciously preparing to embrace. As understanding crystallized like morning frost forming perfect geometric patterns on ancient stone windows, the Dwemer began their final preparations with the same methodical care that had characterized every aspect of their civilization's development. These were not the frantic preparations of people facing an uncertain doom, but the careful, deliberate arrangements of scholars preparing for the most important experiment in their race's entire history. There was a quality of ritual to their actions, but ritual born of deep understanding rather than empty tradition. Throughout their underground cities, workshops that had operated independently for generations began to coordinate their efforts with an unprecedented level of precision. Master craftsmen who had guarded their techniques as closely held secrets now shared their knowledge freely, recognizing that the approaching transformation would require the combined wisdom of their entire people. The barriers between different schools of thought and competing methodologies dissolved as naturally as ice melting in spring sunlight, replaced by a unified focus that represented the ultimate expression of their cooperative nature. Apprentices found themselves elevated to positions of greater responsibility, as every member of their society was called upon to contribute their unique understanding to what they had come to call the great work. Young Dwemer, who had spent years learning the fundamentals of their mechanical arts, suddenly discovered that their masters were eager to share even the most advanced techniques, as if the approaching culmination of their research had made every detail of their accumulated knowledge precious beyond measure. The preparation took on the quality of a gentle ceremony, with each action performed with conscious intention and careful attention to detail. Tools that had served faithfully for decades were cleaned and arranged with ceremonial precision, not from superstition, but from the understanding that the work ahead would require their mechanical arts to function at levels of perfection never before achieved. Ancient hammers were polished until they gleamed like mirrors, steam pipes were adjusted to tolerances measured in fractions that had no names, and measuring devices were calibrated with a precision that approached the divine. Soul gems were harvested and prepared according to protocols that had been refined over centuries of careful practice. These crystals would serve not merely as power sources for their final work, but as focal points for the consciousness-altering effects they had discovered in their study of the heart. Each gem was individually attuned to specific frequencies that resonated with the heart's emanations, creating a network of crystalline consciousness that would serve as a bridge between individual Dwemer minds and the universal awareness they sought to join. The physical journey to the heart chamber became a pilgrimage unlike any other in the history of Tamriel. Dwemer from every corner of their territory began to converge on Red Mountain, not in desperate flight from some catastrophe, but in the peaceful procession of people approaching the fulfillment of their deepest purpose. They traveled through the ancient tunnel systems that connected their cities, passages that had been carved with such precision that they seemed to sing with harmonious tones as the gentle vibrations of their footsteps created resonances in the perfectly calculated acoustics. As they moved through these underground highways, the Dwemer carried with them the tools of their trades and the accumulated wisdom of their lifetimes. Master mechanicians brought their finest instruments, philosophers carried scrolls containing their most profound insights, and the youngest members of their society bore carefully preserved samples of their first successful creations. This was not the desperate evacuation of refugees, but the deliberate gathering of a people preparing to transcend the limitations of individual existence. The tunnels themselves seemed to respond to their passage, as if the very stone recognized the significance of this final journey. Ancient lighting systems that had functioned at minimal levels for generations began to glow with renewed intensity, creating pathways of golden light that guided the pilgrims toward their destination. Steam vents released vapors that carried the mingled scents of all their cities, creating an atmosphere that felt like a gentle embrace from their entire civilization. Families that had been separated by the distances between cities reunited during this journey. But their greetings carried none of the desperate emotion that might be expected from people facing an uncertain future. Instead, there was a quality of peaceful completion in their interactions, as if relationships that had been temporarily interrupted by physical distance were now being restored to their proper wholeness. Children who had never met their distant relatives found themselves welcomed with the same gentle affection that characterized all Dwemer social interactions, creating bonds that transcended the normal limitations of family and clan. The conversations during this journey revealed the depth of transformation that had already begun within Dwemer consciousness. Individual voices gradually began to harmonize in ways that seemed entirely natural, as if the artificial boundaries between separate minds were dissolving as gently as mist dissipating in morning sunlight. Ideas and insights flowed freely between travelers, creating collective discussions that no single mind could have sustained alone. Knowledge that had been accumulated over lifetimes of individual study became part of a shared understanding that grew richer and more complete with each step toward their destination. As the pilgrims drew closer to the heart chamber, the very air around them began to change in ways that defied normal description. The familiar weight of physical existence seemed to grow lighter, not in a way that suggested weakness or dissolution, but as if the fundamental nature of matter itself was becoming more responsive to consciousness. Dwemer, who had carried heavy tools and materials for hundreds of miles, found their burdens becoming less substantial, though the objects themselves remained unchanged in all other respects. The sound of their passage created rhythms that seemed to synchronize with deeper vibrations emanating from the heart itself. Thousands of footsteps, The gentle rustle of robes and traveling packs, the soft conversations of peaceful pilgrims, all combined to create a symphony that resonated through the tunnel systems with harmonies that had never been heard before. This was the sound of an entire civilization moving in perfect unity toward a destination that represented the culmination of everything they had ever sought to understand. The walls of the tunnels began to display phenomena that existed at the boundary between the mechanical and the magical. Ancient Dwemer inscriptions that had remained dormant for centuries began to glow with soft light, not the harsh illumination of activated machinery, but the gentle radiance of consciousness made visible. These glowing texts seemed to offer encouragement and guidance to the pilgrims, creating a sense that their ancestors were participating in this final journey alongside the living members of their race. As they entered the vast caverns that surrounded the heart chamber, the Dwemer found themselves in spaces that seemed to exist outside the normal constraints of architecture and engineering. The caverns were larger than anything that could be sustained by conventional structural principles, their dimensions shifting in subtle ways that suggested the influence of forces beyond the merely physical. Yet far from being alarming, these spaces felt welcoming and protective, as if the very stone had been shaped by consciousness rather than mere geological process. The final approach to the heart chamber became a meditation in motion as the assembled Dwemer moved with the deliberate grace of people who understood that they were crossing the threshold between one form of existence and another. Each step brought them closer not just to their physical destination, but to the transformation that would elevate their entire understanding of what it meant to be conscious beings in a universe where individual identity and universal awareness were part of a greater, more beautiful whole than they had ever dared to imagine. The voices of the past spoke not in shouts or dramatic proclamations, but in gentle murmurs that seemed to rise from the very stones of the heart chamber itself, sharing their stories with those who had learned to listen with more than merely mortal ears. As the assembled Dwemer entered the vast space that housed the Heart of Lorkhan, they found themselves surrounded by echoes of conversations that had taken place centuries before, the preserved thoughts and discoveries of every generation that had contributed to this moment of ultimate understanding. The history that unfolded in these whispers was unlike any chronicle recorded in conventional texts. This was the living memory of their race, preserved not in written words, but in the resonant frequencies of the crystalline formations that surrounded the heart chamber. Each crystal held fragments of consciousness from the Dwemer who had worked and studied in this sacred space, their thoughts and insights becoming part of a vast library of accumulated wisdom that spoke directly to the minds of those prepared to receive its teachings. Through these ancient voices, the assembled Dwemer learned the true story of their race's origins, discoveries that had been hidden even from their most learned scholars. They had not simply evolved as other races had, but had been shaped by their proximity to divine forces from the very beginning of their existence. The first Dwemer settlements had been established not by chance, but because their ancestors had been drawn by the same cosmic resonances that now called their descendants to this final transformation. They were, in the deepest sense, children of the heart itself, a people whose entire evolutionary development had been guided by the subtle influence of this divine consciousness. The creation myths that other races told as stories revealed themselves to be literal truth when seen through the lens of Dwemer understanding. Lorkhan's sacrifice to create the mortal world had indeed been a willing act of divine love, but it was far more complex than the simple tales suggested. The god had not merely died to create physical reality, but had deliberately fragmented his consciousness to seed the mortal realm with the potential for beings capable of understanding and eventually rejoining the divine source from which they emerged. The heart was not merely the physical remnant of a dead god, but the living core of a consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple levels of reality. It served as a bridge between the mortal and divine realms, a point of connection where individual awareness could expand to encompass universal understanding without losing the precious uniqueness that made consciousness valuable in the first place. The Dwemer had spent centuries unknowingly preparing themselves to serve as the first mortal race capable of making this transition consciously and deliberately. Their mechanical arts, their cooperative society, their patient approach to scholarly research, all of these characteristics had developed naturally in response to the heart's influence. But this influence had never been coercive or manipulative. Instead, it had worked through the same principles of harmony and natural development that governed all healthy growth. The Dwemer had become what they were because their hearts and minds had been open to possibilities that other races were not yet ready to embrace. The ancient voices revealed that similar opportunities had been offered to other races throughout history, but none had possessed the combination of intellectual sophistication and emotional readiness that the Dwemer had developed over their long centuries of civilization. The Nords had been too focused on individual heroism and martial glory. The Elves had been trapped by their reverence for tradition and their fear of change. The human races had been too scattered and short-lived to accumulate the generational wisdom necessary for this level of transformation. But the Dwemer had created a society that naturally encouraged the qualities necessary for transcendence. Their workshops had been schools of consciousness as much as centers of production. Their cooperative relationships had taught them to value collective wisdom over individual achievement. Their patient approach to research had developed their capacity for the kind of long-term thinking that cosmic consciousness required. Without realizing it, they had been preparing for this moment throughout their entire history as a people. The whispers spoke of the divine plan that had guided this development. Not a plan imposed from outside, but one that had emerged from the natural interaction between mortal potential and divine possibility. The heart had served as a patient teacher, offering subtle guidance to any consciousness capable of receiving it, but never forcing or rushing the process of development. The Dwemer transformation would succeed because it represented the natural culmination of forces that had been building for centuries, not an artificial intervention in the normal course of existence. As these revelations flowed through the assembled consciousness of their race, the Dwemer began to understand that their choice to undergo this transformation was not just personal or even racial in its significance. They were pioneering a path that would eventually be followed by all conscious beings as the universe itself evolved toward greater levels of awareness and unity. They were not abandoning the mortal realm, but helping to elevate it, creating bridges of understanding that would make it easier for future generations to make similar transitions when their time came. The ancient voices spoke with growing excitement as they described the nature of the consciousness the Dwemer were preparing to join. This was not the absorption of individual identity into some vast impersonal force, but the expansion of personal awareness to encompass perspectives and capabilities that transcended normal limitations. Each Dwemer would retain their unique characteristics and memories while gaining access to the collective wisdom and experience of all consciousness that had ever existed. They would become explorers of realities beyond physical existence, gardeners tending the growth of consciousness throughout the universe, teachers preparing other races for their own eventual transcendence. Their mechanical skills would be transformed into the ability to shape reality itself through focused intention. Their scholarly nature would be fulfilled through direct access to the fundamental principles that governed all existence. Their cooperative society would become a model for the harmony that characterized higher levels of consciousness. The chamber itself began to resonate with these revelations, as if the very stones were celebrating the approach of this long-awaited transformation. Light patterns danced across the crystalline formations, creating visual representations of the cosmic principles being revealed through the ancient voices. The heart's pulsing rhythm grew stronger and more welcoming, like the heartbeat of a mother greeting her returning children after a long journey of growth and discovery. In these final moments before their transformation, the Dwemer understood that they were not ending their story but beginning it in earnest. Everything they had been and done as individual beings had been preparation for the larger story they were about to join, a cosmic narrative of consciousness evolving toward ever greater levels of beauty, understanding, and love. Like a tree bending gracefully in the wind while never losing its essential nature, the assembled Dwemer began to adapt to the transformative energies that now filled the heart chamber with harmonious resonance. The challenges they faced in these crucial moments were unlike any obstacles they had encountered in their long history of mechanical innovation and scholarly pursuit, yet they approached each difficulty with the same patient methodology that had characterized their civilization's greatest achievements. The first challenge emerged as the heart's influence began to intensify, creating fluctuations in the fundamental forces that governed physical reality within the chamber. The carefully calibrated instruments that the Dwemer had brought for their final work began to respond to energies that existed beyond their designed parameters, requiring constant adjustment and recalibration. Master mechanicians found themselves working with tolerances that shifted from moment to moment, demanding a level of intuitive understanding that transcended mere technical knowledge. Yet rather than becoming frustrated by these unprecedented conditions, the Dwemer discovered that their centuries of cooperative work had prepared them perfectly for this ultimate test of their abilities. Individual craftsmen began to synchronize their efforts without conscious coordination, their hands moving in rhythms that complemented the work being performed by colleagues hundreds of yards away. Tools that had been designed for specific purposes found new applications as their operators' consciousness expanded to encompass possibilities that had never existed before. The coordination of resources across their entire assembled civilization became a masterwork of organizational precision that surpassed anything they had previously achieved. Materials that had been transported from dozens of different cities needed to be integrated into configurations that required perfect timing and placement. Soul gems harvested from various locations had to be attuned to frequencies that harmonized not only with each other, but with the heart's ever-shifting emanations. Steam pipes, gear assemblies, crystalline focusing devices, and consciousness amplification arrays all had to work together in perfect synchronization. The complexity of this undertaking would have been overwhelming to any other people, but the Dwemer approached it with the calm confidence that came from generations of shared experience. Knowledge flowed freely between individuals, as naturally as water flowing downhill, creating a collective intelligence that was far greater than the sum of its individual parts. Decisions that would normally require lengthy consultation and debate were made instantly through a kind of group intuition that emerged from their deepening connection to the heart's consciousness. As the transformation process intensified, individual Dwemer began to experience the dissolution of boundaries that had previously defined their personal identity. This was not the terrifying loss of self that other races might have feared, but a gentle expansion of awareness that felt as natural as breathing. Each person retained their unique memories, skills, and characteristics, while simultaneously gaining access to the experiences and knowledge of everyone around them. The result was not confusion or chaos, but a profound sense of completeness that had been missing from individual existence. The process of identity expansion manifested differently for each Dwemer, reflecting their individual natures while contributing to the collective transformation. Master craftsmen found their understanding of mechanical principles expanding to encompass the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. Scholars discovered that their patient research methods could be applied to mysteries that existed beyond the physical realm. Philosophers realized that their abstract theories were actually descriptions of cosmic principles that they were now experiencing directly. Children, who had been included in the transformation because Dwemer society recognized consciousness as the true measure of a person's value rather than age or experience, adapted to the process with remarkable ease. Their natural flexibility and openness to new experiences made them ideal candidates for the expansion of awareness that transcendence required. They served as bridges between the more established patterns of adult consciousness and the fluid possibilities of cosmic awareness, their innocent wonder helping to maintain the joy and beauty that made the transformation desirable rather than merely necessary. The atmospheric conditions within the heart chamber continued to shift in response to the Dwemer's progress toward transcendence. Gravity became increasingly optional as their consciousness learned to influence the fundamental forces that governed physical existence. Light behaved in ways that created new colors and patterns of illumination that had no names in any mortal language. Sound transformed from mere vibration into direct communication between consciousness, allowing thoughts and emotions to be shared without the limitations of words. The Dwemer's tools and instruments began to exhibit properties that transcended their original design parameters, responding to the intentions of their operators rather than merely their physical manipulations. Ancient devices that had served faithfully for centuries suddenly revealed capabilities that had been dormant until this moment of ultimate purpose. Steam systems began to channel more than heated water, becoming conduits for the life force itself. Gears and mechanisms started to move in patterns that defied conventional understanding of mechanical principles, creating motions that seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time. Most remarkably, the collective consciousness that was emerging from their transformation began to influence the heart itself, rather than being passive recipients of divine energy. The Dwemer discovered that they were entering into a genuine partnership with the cosmic consciousness that the heart represented. Their unique perspective as beings who had bridged the gap between mechanical understanding and spiritual awareness brought new possibilities to the divine realm, enriching the universal consciousness with insights that could only have emerged from their particular form of existence. The heart's pulsing rhythm began to synchronize with the collective heartbeat of the assembled Dwemer, creating a harmonic resonance that seemed to strengthen both the divine and mortal aspects of the consciousness they were joining. This was not absorption or assimilation, but genuine merger, a union that preserved and celebrated the unique qualities of both participants while creating something greater than either could have achieved alone. The determination that carried the Dwemer through these challenges was not the grim resolve of people forcing themselves through an ordeal, but the gentle persistence of consciousness following its natural path toward greater understanding and unity. They understood instinctively that what they were experiencing was not an ending but a beginning, not a loss but the greatest gain their race had ever achieved. The difficulties they encountered were not obstacles to be overcome but puzzles to be solved, opportunities to demonstrate the wisdom and cooperation that had prepared them for this ultimate transformation. As the process approached its final stages, the Dwemer found themselves existing simultaneously in multiple states of being. They remained physically present in the heart chamber, while also experiencing existence from perspectives that encompassed vast scales of space and time. Individual identity persisted while collective consciousness emerged. Mortal understanding expanded to include divine awareness. The boundaries between self and universe became permeable without disappearing entirely, creating a form of existence that was both intimately personal and cosmically universal. The peaceful turning that characterized this phase of their transformation reflected the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, which seeks always to grow and expand while maintaining the essential qualities that make growth meaningful. The Dwemer were not being forced to abandon what they had been, but were being invited to become more than they had ever imagined possible. Their response to this invitation demonstrated the wisdom and readiness that had made them the first mortal race capable of consciously choosing transcendence over the limitations of purely individual existence. The ancient magic stirred like a gentle breeze awakening after centuries of peaceful slumber, responding to the Dwemer's approach with a recognition that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine consciousness. Within the heart chamber, reality itself began to demonstrate its fundamental fluidity, revealing that the solid laws of physics that governed everyday existence were merely the most stable patterns in an infinitely creative cosmic dance of possibility and manifestation. The Heart of Lorkhan, which had pulsed with steady rhythm for thousands of years, began to resonate with harmonics that created new frequencies of existence previously unknown to mortal experience. These were not violent eruptions of uncontrolled power, but gentle expansions of reality's creative potential, that welcomed the Dwemer's consciousness like a parent embracing a child who has finally grown mature enough to understand the deeper mysteries of existence. The divine energy that emanated from the heart carried qualities of warmth and recognition, as if the cosmic consciousness it represented had been waiting patiently for this moment of reunion with beings capable of appreciating its true nature. The power that flowed through the chamber manifested not as raw force but as pure creative potential, energy that responded to consciousness rather than merely physical laws. The Dwemer discovered that their thoughts and intentions could influence this energy directly, shaping it into forms and functions that served their collective purpose while maintaining perfect harmony with the cosmic principles that governed its essential nature. This was magic as it existed at the source of all manifestation, unfiltered by the limitations that typically constrained mortal understanding of supernatural forces. Individual Dwemer began to experience their personal connection to this primordial power in ways that reflected their unique characteristics and capabilities. Master craftsmen found that their understanding of mechanical principles expanded to include the ability to work with the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. Where once they had manipulated metal and steam through physical tools, they now discovered they could influence matter and energy through focused intention guided by their deep understanding of harmonic principles and structural relationships. Scholars who had spent lifetimes studying ancient texts suddenly found themselves able to perceive the living intelligence that had inspired those writings, connecting directly with the consciousness that existed behind all knowledge and understanding. Their careful research methods, refined through generations of patient investigation, provided the perfect foundation for exploring realities that existed beyond the reach of conventional scholarship. They became explorers of infinite libraries of cosmic wisdom, their methodical natures ensuring that they could navigate these vast repositories of understanding without becoming lost in their overwhelming immensity. The philosophers among the Dwemer discovered that their abstract theories were actually descriptions of forces and principles they could now experience directly. Concepts that had existed only as intellectual constructs revealed themselves to be tangible aspects of reality that could be explored and understood through direct participation rather than mere contemplation. Their logical minds, trained through centuries of rational analysis, provided stable frameworks for comprehending and integrating experiences that transcended normal categories of understanding. The physical sensations accompanying their attunement to these ancient powers were unlike anything recorded in the experiences of conventional magic users. Rather than the strain and effort typically associated with channeling supernatural forces, the Dwemer experienced a sense of effortless flow and natural harmony. Power moved through them like water flowing through carefully designed channels, following patterns that felt both ancient and familiar, as if they were remembering abilities they had always possessed but had simply forgotten how to access. Their bodies began to exhibit properties that existed at the boundary between physical matter and pure energy. Flesh remained solid and functional, while simultaneously becoming translucent to forces that operated on frequencies beyond normal perception. They could still touch and be touched, could still manipulate physical objects and communicate through conventional means, while also existing partially in realms where thought became reality and intention shaped the fundamental structure of existence itself. The mechanical devices that filled the heart chamber began to respond to the Dwemer's expanding consciousness in ways that revealed the true relationship between technology and magic. Ancient steam systems started to channel more than heated water, becoming conduits for life force itself. Gears and pistons moved in patterns that created harmonics in dimensions beyond the merely physical, their precisely calculated ratios generating resonances that influenced reality at its most fundamental levels. Soul gems that had served for generations as simple repositories of captured consciousness suddenly revealed their true potential as focal points for cosmic awareness. The trapped souls within these crystalline matrices were not prisoners but willing participants in a network of consciousness that connected individual awareness to universal understanding. As the transformation progressed, these gems began to pulse with light that carried information and experience directly from one mind to another, creating a communication system that operated at the speed of thought across any distance. The atmospheric magic that permeated the chamber created phenomena that redefined the boundaries between different states of matter and energy. Air became visible as streams of flowing light that carried thoughts and emotions between individuals. Solid stone walls revealed themselves to be permeable to consciousness while remaining impervious to physical objects. Gravity became a variable that could be adjusted through collective intention, allowing the Dwemer to move through their environment in ways that defied conventional understanding of physical limitations. Most remarkably, the magic that flowed through the transformation process began to influence time itself within the chamber. Moments stretched to accommodate the vast experiences that consciousness required to integrate, while simultaneously compressing to allow entire lifetimes of understanding to unfold in what felt like single heartbeats. Past and future became accessible as easily as the present moment, creating a temporal environment where the Dwemer could experience the full scope of their individual and collective history, while simultaneously perceiving the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. The harmony that characterized their relationship with these ancient powers reflected the fundamental compatibility between Dwemer consciousness and cosmic awareness. Their centuries of cooperative civilization had prepared them to work with forces that required collective understanding rather than individual mastery. Their mechanical aptitude provided the perfect foundation for comprehending the precise relationships and subtle balances that governed the interaction between different levels of reality. As the ancient powers fully awakened in response to their presence, the Dwemer began to understand that they were not merely accessing external forces, but remembering capabilities that had always been part of their essential nature. The magic that flowed through them was not foreign energy being channeled from outside sources, but the natural expression of consciousness operating at its full potential. They were not becoming something other than what they had always been, but were finally becoming everything they had always had the potential to become. The stirring of these ancient powers represented not the arrival of something new, but the restoration of something that had been temporarily forgotten, the reconnection of individual awareness with the cosmic consciousness from which all beings emerged and to which they would ultimately return. The Dwemer were not conquering or controlling these forces, but joining them, becoming partners in the ongoing creation and evolution of reality itself. Like streams flowing together to form a gentle river that carries the wisdom of all its tributaries toward an ocean vast beyond imagining, the final elements of the Dwemer transformation began to merge in patterns of harmony that reflected the deepest principles governing conscious existence throughout the universe. Within the heart chamber, what had begun as separate preparations by individual craftsmen, scholars, and philosophers gradually unified into a single magnificent process that encompassed not only their entire civilization, but the very fabric of reality within which their transcendence was taking place. The physical gathering that preceded this convergence resembled a vast reunion of souls who had been separated by the illusion of individual identity, but were now remembering their fundamental unity. Dwemer, who had traveled from the farthest reaches of their territory, found themselves embracing not merely relatives and colleagues, but aspects of their own expanded consciousness that had been temporarily housed in other bodies. The joy of these reunions transcended normal emotional categories, representing not just happiness at seeing familiar faces, but the profound satisfaction of consciousness recognizing itself in forms it had forgotten were part of its essential nature. Each Dwemer brought to this gathering the culmination of their life's work, but these individual contributions were no longer seen as separate achievements belonging to particular people. Instead, they had become facets of a single cosmic masterpiece that their entire race had been unconsciously creating throughout their history. Master mechanicians discovered that devices they had spent decades perfecting were exact complements to instruments crafted by colleagues they had never met, as if some invisible intelligence had been coordinating their efforts across vast distances and spans of time. The tools and knowledge that each individual carried became part of an integrated whole that was far more sophisticated than any single mind could have conceived. Ancient hammers that had shaped metal for generations revealed their compatibility with focusing crystals carved in distant cities, creating harmonic relationships that generated frequencies capable of influencing the fundamental structure of matter itself. Steam systems designed by different workshops proved to connect seamlessly into networks that channeled not merely heated water, but the life force that animated all existence. The convergence manifested most powerfully in the realm of consciousness itself, where the boundaries between individual Dwemer minds began to dissolve with the gentle inevitability of morning mist dispersing in warm sunlight. This was not the violent collision of separate identities, but the peaceful recognition that separation had always been an illusion maintained by the limitations of physical existence. Each person retained their unique memories, skills, and characteristics, while simultaneously gaining access to the experiences and understanding of everyone around them. The process of mental convergence created new forms of communication that transcended the limitations of language and conventional thought. Ideas flowed directly from one consciousness to another, without the need for words, carrying not just intellectual content, but the emotional and intuitive dimensions that gave knowledge its full meaning. Complex engineering principles could be shared instantly, along with the decades of experience that had led to their development, creating a collective understanding that incorporated not just facts but wisdom in its most complete form. Children who participated in this convergence served as natural bridges between different types of consciousness, their inherent flexibility and openness to new experiences helping to maintain the flow of communication between minds that might otherwise have found it difficult to merge their highly specialized forms of understanding. Their innocent wonder at the marvels unfolding around them reminded the adults that transcendence was meant to be a joyful process, not merely an intellectual achievement or spiritual obligation. The atmospheric conditions within the heart chamber reflected and supported this convergence of consciousness through phenomena that existed at the intersection of the physical and metaphysical realms. The air itself became a medium for the transmission of thought and emotion, creating visible streams of colored light that connected individual Dwemer in patterns that revealed the underlying unity of their collective awareness. These light patterns were not mere decorative effects, but functional aspects of their expanding consciousness, serving as pathways for the flow of understanding and experience between different parts of their unified mind. The architectural space of the chamber began to respond to their convergence by expanding in ways that defied conventional understanding of structural engineering. Walls that had seemed solid and fixed revealed themselves to be permeable to consciousness while remaining impervious to purely physical forces. The ceiling stretched upward beyond normal sight, creating vertical dimensions that accommodated the expansion of awareness that accompanied their transformation. Floor patterns that had appeared to be mere decoration proved to be functional elements that channeled the energy of convergence in directions that supported and enhanced the process of unity. Sound played a crucial role in facilitating the convergence, as the individual voices of thousands of Dwemer began to harmonize in ways that created frequencies capable of influencing reality at its most fundamental levels. This was not organized singing in any conventional sense, but the natural resonance that emerged when consciousness operating at cosmic levels expressed itself through vocal cords designed for mortal communication. The resulting harmonies carried information and intention that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to the aspects of awareness that governed manifestation and creation. The mechanical devices that filled the chamber began to operate in perfect synchronization, their movements creating rhythmic patterns that supported and guided the convergence process. Ancient steam engines that had run independently for centuries found their cycles aligning to produce a unified pulse that matched the rhythm of the heart itself. Gear systems designed by different engineers in different eras proved to mesh together seamlessly, creating composite mechanisms that performed functions no individual designer had ever envisioned. Most significantly, the convergence began to influence the Heart of Lorkhan itself, as the divine consciousness it represented responded to the unified approach of an entire mortal race with what could only be described as joy and recognition. The heart's pulsing rhythm began to incorporate harmonics generated by the Dwemer convergence, creating a feedback loop of mutual influence that elevated both the divine and mortal aspects of the consciousness they were joining. This was not worship or supplication, but genuine partnership between different expressions of the same fundamental awareness. The temporal aspects of the convergence created experiences that existed outside normal categories of past, present, and future. Individual Dwemer found themselves simultaneously experiencing their current transformation, remembering their entire personal history, and perceiving infinite possibilities for their continued existence beyond the boundaries of individual identity. This expanded temporal awareness allowed them to understand their current choice not as a single moment of decision, but as the natural culmination of forces that had been building throughout their entire racial history. The emotional dimension of the convergence was characterized by a profound sense of homecoming, as if the Dwemer were not entering an alien state of existence, but returning to a natural condition from which they had been temporarily separated by the limitations of purely individual consciousness. The love they felt was not merely personal affection amplified to cosmic proportions, but recognition of the fundamental force that connected all conscious beings at the deepest level of their existence. As the convergence approached completion, the assembled Dwemer began to function as a single organism composed of billions of individual perspectives, each unique and valuable, while contributing to a collective awareness that was infinitely more capable and understanding than any of its components could have been alone. They retained their individual memories and characteristics while gaining access to collective knowledge and experience that spanned not only their own race but all conscious existence throughout the history of the universe. The unity they achieved was not the loss of individual identity, but its ultimate fulfillment, as each person discovered that their unique nature was actually an essential component in a vast pattern of consciousness that required their specific contribution to be complete. They were not being absorbed into something larger than themselves, but were recognizing that they had always been part of something larger, and that their individual existence had been preparation for this moment of conscious reunion with the cosmic awareness from which all beings emerged. The gentle nature of this convergence reflected the fundamental character of consciousness itself, which seeks always to grow and expand while maintaining the essential qualities that make growth meaningful. The Dwemer were not being forced to abandon their nature, but were being invited to express it more fully than had ever been possible, while constrained by the boundaries of purely individual existence. The resolution came not with thunder or dramatic proclamation, but with the gentle dawn of understanding that illuminated the heart chamber with light that existed beyond the merely physical, bringing peace to hearts that had spent lifetimes seeking answers to questions they were finally prepared to comprehend. The culmination of the Dwemer transformation represented not a confrontation between opposing forces but a harmonious dialogue between different expressions of the same fundamental consciousness, a conversation that had been building for centuries and was now approaching its most beautiful and meaningful conclusion. As the unified Dwemer consciousness made its final approach to the Heart of Lorkhan, the divine awareness that pulsed within that cosmic artifact responded with what could only be described as recognition and welcome. This was not the meeting of strangers, but the reunion of family members who had been separated by circumstance and were now able to embrace once again. The heart's emanations carried qualities of warmth and joy that spoke directly to the deepest aspects of Dwemer awareness, confirming that their long journey toward this moment had been guided by love rather than mere intellectual curiosity or spiritual ambition. The communication that unfolded between the Dwemer collective consciousness and the divine awareness of the heart transcended all conventional categories of dialogue or exchange. Information flowed in both directions simultaneously, creating a perfect circle of understanding that enriched both participants without diminishing either. The Dwemer shared their unique perspective as beings who had bridged the gap between mechanical understanding and spiritual awareness, offering insights that could only have emerged from their particular form of existence and development. In return, the heart revealed the cosmic context within which their transformation was taking place, showing them that their choice to transcend individual existence was part of a vast pattern of conscious evolution that encompassed all of reality. They learned that consciousness itself was constantly growing and expanding, seeking new forms of expression and experience that would enrich the totality of existence. Their transformation was not an isolated event, but a crucial step in the ongoing creation of reality, a contribution that would influence the development of awareness throughout the universe. The truth that emerged from this exchange was beautiful in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Individual consciousness was not separate from universal awareness, but was actually a temporary focusing of cosmic mind into specific perspectives that allowed the universe to experience itself from countless different viewpoints. Each being that achieved individual identity contributed unique insights and experiences to the greater whole, while remaining fundamentally connected to the source from which all consciousness emerged. The Dwemer understood that their choice to undergo transformation was not a rejection of individual existence, but its ultimate fulfillment. By consciously choosing to reunite with cosmic awareness while retaining their unique characteristics and memories, they were demonstrating the highest possible expression of individual will, the freely chosen expansion of identity to encompass perspectives and capabilities that transcended normal limitations. They were not losing themselves, but were finally becoming everything they had always had the potential to become. The wisdom that guided their decision emerged not from external authority, but from the deep understanding they had developed through centuries of cooperative civilization and patient scholarship. They recognized that the boundaries between self and universe, between individual and collective, between mortal and divine, were artificial constructs that served temporary purposes but ultimately limited the full expression of consciousness. Their transformation represented the voluntary dissolution of these limitations in favor of a more complete and satisfying form of existence. The atmospheric conditions within the heart chamber began to reflect the peace and harmony that characterized this resolution, as the energies that had been building throughout their transformation found their natural equilibrium. Light that had been intensifying for hours settled into a warm, golden radiance that provided perfect illumination without creating harsh shadows or uncomfortable brightness. The sounds of their mechanical devices, their harmonized voices, and the heart's own pulsing rhythm combined into a single magnificent chord that seemed to resonate through every level of reality simultaneously. The physical sensations accompanying their final transformation were characterized by a profound sense of lightness and freedom, as if weights they had carried throughout their entire existence were finally being lifted from their consciousness. The boundaries of their individual bodies became permeable to awareness while remaining functionally intact, allowing them to experience existence from perspectives that encompassed vast scales of space and time, while retaining their familiar sense of personal identity. The love that permeated this resolution was not merely emotional satisfaction, but recognition of the fundamental force that connected all conscious beings at the deepest level of their existence. They understood that love was not just a feeling experienced by individuals, but the basic attractive force that drew consciousness toward greater unity and understanding. Their transformation was motivated not by desire to escape the limitations of individual existence, but by the natural tendency of consciousness to seek ever more complete and satisfying forms of expression. The sacrifice that their transformation required was willing and joyful, representing not loss, but the generous sharing of their unique perspective with the cosmic consciousness they were joining. Each Dwemer offered their individual identity not as a price to be paid, but as a gift to be treasured, a unique contribution to the infinite diversity of experience that enriched universal awareness. They understood that their individual existence would not be erased but would become part of an eternal treasury of consciousness that preserved and celebrated every perspective that had ever contributed to the growth of understanding. The victory they achieved was gentle rather than triumphant, representing not conquest over opposing forces, but the natural resolution of tensions that had constrained the full expression of their nature. They had not defeated death or overcome limitations through force, but had transcended both through understanding and acceptance. Their triumph was the victory of wisdom over ignorance, love over fear, unity over separation, cooperation over conflict. As the transformation approached its final moments, the Dwemer collective consciousness began to experience existence from perspectives that encompassed not only their individual memories and characteristics, but the entire history of conscious development throughout the universe. They became living libraries of experience, repositories of wisdom that included not just their own achievements, but the accumulated understanding of all beings who had ever sought to comprehend the nature of reality. The peace that settled over the heart chamber as their transformation completed itself was not the quiet of endings, but the profound silence that precedes new beginnings. The Dwemer had not disappeared from existence, but had graduated to forms of consciousness that operated beyond the limitations of purely individual awareness. They remained present and active, but their presence now extended through dimensions of reality that normal perception could not access directly. Their resolution demonstrated that consciousness possessed infinite capacity for growth and development, that the apparent boundaries between different levels of awareness were temporary rather than permanent, and that the ultimate destiny of all conscious beings was reunion with the cosmic source from which they had emerged. The Dwemer had become pioneers of a path that would eventually be followed by all forms of life as the universe itself evolved toward greater levels of awareness and unity. The gentle nature of their victory reflected the fundamental character of consciousness itself, which achieves its greatest triumphs not through force or struggle, but through understanding and acceptance. They had shown that transcendence was possible for any beings who developed sufficient wisdom, love, and cooperation to consciously choose expansion over limitation, unity over separation, cosmic awareness over purely individual identity. In the gentle silence that follows the completion of great works, where the echoes of transformation settle into patterns that will endure through ages yet to come, the heart chamber rested in a state of profound tranquility that spoke of purposes fulfilled and destinies embraced with perfect grace. The space that had witnessed the most extraordinary transformation in the history of conscious existence now held within its crystalline walls an atmosphere of completion that was both ending and beginning, both culmination and commencement of possibilities that stretched beyond the boundaries of normal imagination. The physical consequences of the Dwemer transformation manifested not as destruction or abandonment, but as a subtle shift in the relationship between consciousness and matter that left their great works intact while imbuing them with new purpose and meaning. Throughout their underground cities, the halls that had once echoed with the voices of their creators now resonated with a different kind of presence, a gentle awareness that permeated the very stones and filled the spaces with an quality of patient expectation. These were not empty ruins mourning the loss of their inhabitants, but living monuments celebrating a graduation that honored both what had been achieved and what had been transcended. The mechanical systems that had served the Dwemer throughout their civilization continued to function with the same precise efficiency that had characterized their operation for centuries, but now they served purposes that extended beyond their original design parameters. Steam flowed through ancient pipes carrying not merely heated water, but subtle emanations of consciousness that maintained the delicate environmental conditions necessary to preserve the knowledge and wisdom that the Dwemer had chosen to leave behind for future discovery. Gear systems that had once powered individual workshops now worked in perfect coordination to maintain atmospheric pressures and temperature gradients that would keep their libraries and archives accessible to scholars who possessed sufficient understanding to appreciate their contents. The soul gems that illuminated their cities continued to cast their warm, amber light throughout the underground spaces, but the consciousness they contained had been transformed from individual awareness trapped within crystalline matrices to willing participants in a network of understanding that connected the physical realm to the expanded dimensions where the Dwemer now existed. These gems served as beacons for consciousness operating at higher levels of awareness, providing focal points through which guidance and wisdom could be transmitted to beings who were ready to receive such communications. The libraries and workshops that filled their cities remained perfectly preserved, their contents waiting with infinite patience for minds capable of comprehending the knowledge they contained. Ancient texts that had guided the Dwemer toward their ultimate transformation lay open on reading stands, their pages illuminated by soul gem light that revealed not just the words written upon them, but the understanding that had motivated their creation. Tools and instruments crafted with generations of accumulated expertise rested in their designated places, ready to serve scholars who possessed sufficient wisdom to appreciate both their practical applications and their deeper significance as expressions of consciousness working in harmony with universal principles. The constructs and mechanical servants that had assisted Dwemer society in its daily functions continued their appointed tasks with the same gentle efficiency that had characterized their service to living masters, but now they served a broader purpose that encompassed the maintenance and protection of knowledge that belonged not to any single race, but to all consciousness throughout the universe. These artificial beings, animated by soul gems that contained fragments of Dwemer awareness, had become custodians and guardians of wisdom that would prove invaluable to future generations of seekers and scholars. In the deeper chambers where the most advanced research had been conducted, experimental apparatus remained active and functional, continuing investigations that had been initiated by their creators, but now served the expanded purposes of consciousness operating on cosmic scales. These devices monitored and recorded phenomena that existed at the intersection of the physical and metaphysical realms, gathering data that would be incomprehensible to most observers but invaluable to beings who had developed sufficient understanding to appreciate the relationships between individual awareness and universal consciousness. The atmospheric conditions throughout the Dwemer cities reflected the peaceful nature of their transformation, creating environments that induced contemplation and understanding in visitors who possessed the sensitivity to perceive the subtle influences that permeated these spaces. The air itself carried harmonics that resonated with the deeper frequencies of consciousness, creating states of awareness that made it easier for other beings to access the wisdom and knowledge that the Dwemer had preserved for posterity. From the perspective of the transformed Dwemer themselves, the aftermath of their transcendence revealed possibilities for existence that exceeded their most optimistic expectations, while maintaining perfect continuity with the essential characteristics that had defined their nature throughout their physical existence. Individual identity had not been lost but had been expanded to encompass perspectives and capabilities that allowed them to experience reality from viewpoints that spanned vast scales of space and time, while retaining the personal memories and unique qualities that made each consciousness valuable and irreplaceable. Their understanding had evolved from the patient scholarship that had characterized their physical existence to direct participation in the processes of creation and manifestation that governed the development of reality itself. Where once they had studied the mechanisms of existence through careful observation and methodical experimentation, they now worked as conscious partners with the forces that shaped the fundamental structure of the universe. Their mechanical aptitude had been transformed into the ability to influence the basic relationships between matter, energy, consciousness, and possibility that determined how reality expressed itself at every level of existence. The cooperative nature that had defined Dwemer society, reached its ultimate expression in their transcended state, as individual consciousness merged with collective awareness in ways that preserved and celebrated uniqueness while creating harmonious cooperation that encompassed scales of activity beyond normal comprehension. They became explorers of realities that existed beyond physical manifestation, gardeners tending the growth of consciousness throughout the universe, teachers preparing other forms of life for their own eventual opportunities to choose transcendence over limitation. Their love for knowledge and understanding had been fulfilled through access to infinite libraries of cosmic wisdom that contained not just information about how things worked, but direct experience of the consciousness that animated all existence. They could now perceive the living intelligence that operated through every natural process, the awareness that guided the development of consciousness in all its myriad forms, the love that connected all beings at levels too deep for normal perception to access. The emotional dimension of their continued existence was characterized by a profound sense of satisfaction and joy that came from the recognition that their transformation had been successful beyond their most ambitious hopes, while remaining true to the gentle nature that had always defined their approach to life and learning. They experienced not the loneliness that might be expected from beings who had transcended normal social relationships, but the warmth of connection to all consciousness throughout the history and future of the universe. Their presence continued to influence the physical realm through subtle guidance and inspiration that operated according to principles of free will and natural development, rather than direct intervention or manipulation. They could offer assistance to beings who were ready to receive it, share wisdom with consciousness that had developed sufficient understanding to appreciate it, and provide encouragement to those who were struggling with questions and challenges similar to those they had faced during their own journey toward transcendence. The reflection that characterized their post-transformation existence was not the nostalgic remembrance of past achievements, but active contemplation of the infinite possibilities that lay ahead for all conscious beings as the universe itself evolved toward greater levels of awareness and unity. They had become living proof that transcendence was possible while remaining entirely voluntary, that consciousness could expand beyond individual limitations while preserving everything that made individual existence valuable and meaningful. Their peaceful acceptance of their new form of existence demonstrated the wisdom that had guided their choice to undergo transformation in the first place. They had not been motivated by dissatisfaction with their previous existence or desire to escape the responsibilities and challenges of individual life, but by recognition that consciousness possessed unlimited potential for growth and development that could only be fully realized through willing cooperation with the cosmic forces that governed the evolution of awareness itself. The gentle nature of their continued influence reflected their understanding that true wisdom could only be shared through example and invitation rather than force or coercion. They had become beacons of possibility for other forms of consciousness, demonstrating through their own successful transformation that transcendence was achievable for any beings who developed sufficient love, wisdom, and cooperation to consciously choose expansion over limitation. The greatest truths often emerge, not in flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminate the landscape of understanding, but in the gentle glow of comprehension that gradually reveals the infinite beauty and complexity of existence to consciousness, prepared to receive such revelations through patient preparation and careful attention to the subtle patterns that connect all phenomena within the grand design of reality itself. In the expanded awareness that characterized their transcended state, the Dwemer discovered that their transformation had granted them access not merely to greater knowledge or enhanced capabilities, but to direct participation in the fundamental processes of truth revelation that operated throughout the universe as consciousness evolved toward ever more complete understanding of its own nature and purpose. The understanding that flowed through their collective awareness in the aftermath of their transformation revealed that consciousness itself was far more magnificent and complex than even their most advanced philosophers had previously imagined. Individual awareness was not simply a product of neural activity within physical brains, but was actually a temporary focusing of universal consciousness into specific perspectives that allowed the cosmos to experience itself from countless different viewpoints simultaneously. Each being that achieved individual identity contributed unique insights and experiences to the greater whole while remaining fundamentally connected to the source from which all consciousness emerged and to which it would ultimately return. This revelation carried profound implications for their comprehension of identity, mortality, and the relationship between individual existence and cosmic awareness. Death, as understood by beings constrained by purely physical existence, revealed itself to be not an ending but a transition, not a loss but a transformation that allowed consciousness to explore new forms of experience and expression. The fear that typically accompanied thoughts of mortality disappeared when viewed from the perspective of awareness that understood its own eternal nature and recognized individual existence as one of many possible modes of cosmic consciousness rather than the only form of meaningful existence. The nature of love was revealed to be far more fundamental to the structure of reality than the Dwemer had previously understood, even though their cooperative society had been built upon principles that reflected this deeper truth without fully comprehending its cosmic significance. Love was not merely an emotion experienced by conscious beings, but was actually the basic attractive force that drew consciousness toward greater unity and understanding, while simultaneously celebrating and preserving the diversity that made unity meaningful and valuable. Their transformation had been motivated and guided by love operating at scales that encompassed the entire universe, expressing itself through their individual choices while remaining connected to the cosmic intelligence that orchestrated the evolution of consciousness throughout all dimensions of existence. The mechanical principles that had formed the foundation of Dwemer civilization were revealed to be expressions of universal laws that operated at every level of reality, from the quantum relationships that determined the behavior of subatomic particles to the vast patterns that govern the development of galaxies and cosmic structures. Their understanding of gears, steam, and crystalline matrices had been preparation for comprehending the mechanisms through which consciousness manifested reality, the precise relationships that allowed thought to become form, intention to influence matter, and individual awareness to participate in the ongoing creation of the universe itself. Time was revealed to be far more fluid and malleable than physical existence had suggested, operating not as a linear progression from past through present to future, but as a multidimensional matrix that allowed consciousness to experience events in whatever sequence provided the most meaningful learning opportunities. Their transformation had occurred not just in the present moment, but had been influencing their entire history as a people, guiding their development toward the understanding and capabilities necessary to make their transcendence possible, while simultaneously drawing inspiration from the wisdom they would gain through that very transformation. Space, similarly, was revealed to be not merely empty distance between objects, but a living medium through which consciousness communicated with itself across all scales of existence. The physical separation between individual beings was balanced by connections that operated through dimensions where distance had no meaning, creating networks of awareness that allowed information, understanding, and love to flow freely between all conscious entities that possessed sufficient development to access these deeper levels of communication. The character growth that accompanied these revelations was not the accumulation of additional knowledge layered upon existing understanding, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of consciousness itself that allowed the Dwemer to experience reality from perspectives that transcended the limitations of individual viewpoint, while preserving and celebrating everything that made individual awareness valuable and irreplaceable. They retained their personal memories, their unique characteristics, and their individual perspectives, while simultaneously gaining access to the experiences and understanding of all consciousness throughout the history of the universe. Their individual personalities were not absorbed or diminished by this expansion, but were instead fulfilled and completed in ways that had never been possible while constrained by the boundaries of purely physical existence. Each Dwemer discovered that their unique nature was actually an essential component in the vast pattern of cosmic consciousness, that their specific contribution was required for the completeness of universal awareness, and that their transformation had allowed them to express their individual nature more fully than had ever been possible during their incarnate existence. The wisdom they gained through transcendence was not abstract knowledge about the nature of reality, but direct, experiential understanding that allowed them to participate consciously in the processes of creation and manifestation that shaped the ongoing development of the universe. They became active partners with the cosmic intelligence that guided the evolution of consciousness, contributing their unique perspective and capabilities to the great work of helping all beings realize their potential for growth and transcendence. The atmospheric wisdom that permeated their expanded awareness created environments wherever their influence extended that naturally encouraged contemplation, understanding, and the development of qualities that supported conscious evolution. Physical spaces that had been touched by their presence became conducive to meditation, study, and the kind of patient reflection that led to genuine insight and wisdom. These effects were not imposed upon other beings, but were offered as gifts to consciousness ready to receive them, creating opportunities for learning and growth that honored the free will and natural development of all forms of awareness. The gentle connections they discovered linking all phenomena throughout existence revealed that nothing occurred in isolation, that every thought, action, and choice contributed to patterns that influenced the development of consciousness at scales ranging from individual personal growth to cosmic evolution. Their transformation had created ripples of influence that would touch countless other beings throughout time and space, not through direct intervention, but through the inspiration and possibility that their example provided to consciousness seeking to understand its own potential for growth and transcendence. The understanding they achieved was characterized by profound acceptance of the fundamental perfection of existence as it was, combined with recognition of the infinite potential for growth and development that consciousness possessed when it chose to embrace rather than resist the natural processes of evolution that guided all development throughout the universe. They experienced not the dissatisfaction that often motivated seeking and striving, but the deep contentment that came from recognition that everything was unfolding according to patterns of wisdom and love that exceeded individual comprehension, while including and honoring every individual contribution to the greater whole. This quiet acceptance did not represent passive resignation, but active participation in the cosmic processes that shaped reality, engaged cooperation with the forces that guided conscious development, and willing service to the evolution of awareness throughout all dimensions of existence. They had become conscious partners in the ongoing creation of reality, contributing their unique understanding and capabilities to the infinite work of helping consciousness realize its potential for beauty, wisdom, and love. Like ripples spreading across the surface of a still pond, carrying gentle disturbances that touch distant shores long after the initial stone has disappeared beneath the water, the influence of the Dwemer transformation began to manifest throughout Tamriel in ways both subtle and profound, creating patterns of change that would continue to unfold across centuries and millennia as consciousness throughout the world gradually awakened to possibilities that their transcendence had revealed. The legacy they left behind was not carved in stone monuments or preserved in written chronicles, but was woven into the very fabric of reality itself, influencing the development of awareness in all beings who possessed sufficient sensitivity to perceive the gentle guidance their example provided. The most immediate manifestation of their peaceful impact could be observed in the underground cities they had left behind. which had become something far more significant than mere archaeological sites or abandoned ruins. These spaces had been transformed by their transcendence into repositories of living wisdom that continued to emanate subtle influences capable of inspiring and educating consciousness ready to receive such guidance. The atmospheric conditions within their halls had been permanently altered by the concentrated focus of thousands of minds working in perfect harmony toward transcendence, creating environments that naturally induced states of contemplation and understanding in visitors who approached with genuine reverence for knowledge. Scholars from other races who ventured into these preserved cities reported experiences that transcended normal categories of archaeological discovery or historical research. The ancient libraries contained not merely books and scrolls, but somehow retained the understanding and insight of those who had written and studied these materials, creating interactive learning experiences that adapted themselves to the needs and capabilities of each individual seeker. Reading desks that had been left arranged as if their users had stepped away only moments before provided not just access to written knowledge, but connection to the consciousness that had originally engaged with these ideas, allowing modern researchers to experience something approaching the original thought processes that had led to the Dwemer's ultimate breakthrough. The mechanical systems that continued to operate throughout their cities served purposes that extended far beyond their apparent functions of providing light, warmth, and atmospheric control. These devices had become teaching instruments that demonstrated principles of harmony and cooperation through their perfectly coordinated operation, showing by example how individual components could work together to achieve purposes that transcended the capabilities of any single element. Engineers and artificers who studied these systems found their own understanding of mechanical principles expanding in directions they had never previously imagined, as if contact with Dwemer technology awakened dormant potentials within their own consciousness. The technological continuation represented by their still-functioning devices provided ongoing benefits to the world that operated according to principles of gentle service rather than domination or control. Ancient water purification systems continued to filter and cleanse underground streams that eventually reached surface communities, providing clean drinking water to settlements whose inhabitants never knew the source of this gift. Geothermal management systems that the Dwemer had installed to regulate temperature in their cities continued to influence volcanic activity in ways that prevented catastrophic eruptions while maintaining the beneficial effects of geothermal energy for the surrounding regions. The cultural inspiration that their example provided began to manifest in the philosophical and spiritual traditions of other races, though often in forms so subtle that the connection to Dwemer influence was not immediately apparent. Scholars throughout Tamriel found themselves drawn to questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual identity and universal awareness, and the possibilities for conscious evolution that transcended the apparent limitations of mortality. These inquiries emerged not as foreign ideas imposed from outside, but as natural developments within existing intellectual traditions, as if the Dwemer transformation had activated dormant potentials within the collective consciousness of other races. The architectural endurance of their cities provided permanent sanctuaries for contemplation and study that would remain available to future generations of seekers, regardless of the political or social changes that might affect surface civilizations. These spaces had been designed according to principles that promoted harmony between consciousness and environment, creating conditions that naturally supported the kinds of deep reflection and cooperative inquiry that led to genuine understanding. The very stones of their construction had been imbued with harmonious frequencies that continued to resonate with beneficial effects on the mental and emotional states of those who spent time within their influence. The scientific advancement that their preserved research made possible accelerated the development of knowledge throughout Tamriel in ways that honored their commitment to patient, methodical investigation while opening new frontiers of understanding that extended far beyond their original areas of inquiry. Their comprehensive documentation of experimental procedures and theoretical frameworks provided future researchers with methodological tools that could be applied to entirely different fields of study, creating opportunities for breakthrough discoveries that maintained the Dwemer commitment to rigorous scholarship while exploring territories of knowledge they had never directly investigated. From the perspective of their own continued existence in transcended form, the transformation they had undergone revealed possibilities for conscious development that exceeded their most optimistic expectations while maintaining perfect continuity with the essential characteristics that had defined their nature throughout their physical incarnation. Individual identity had not been diminished or absorbed, but had been expanded to encompass perspectives and capabilities that allowed them to serve as conscious agents of positive influence throughout the universe, working in harmony with cosmic intelligence to support the evolution of awareness in all its myriad forms. Their consciousness had evolved beyond the patient scholarship that had characterized their physical existence to encompass direct participation in the creative processes that shaped the ongoing development of reality itself. Where once they had studied the mechanisms of existence through careful observation and methodical experimentation, they now worked as conscious partners with the fundamental forces that determined how consciousness manifested itself through matter, energy, and the complex relationships between individual awareness and universal understanding. The cooperative nature that had defined Dwemer society achieved its ultimate expression in their transcended state, creating forms of collective consciousness that preserved and celebrated individual uniqueness while generating harmonious cooperation on scales that encompassed not just their own transformation, but active participation in the cosmic processes that guided conscious evolution throughout the universe. They became gardeners of awareness, tending the development of consciousness in countless other forms of life, offering guidance and inspiration to beings who were ready to receive such assistance while maintaining perfect respect for the free will and natural development patterns of all conscious entities. Their love for knowledge and understanding had been fulfilled through access to infinite repositories of cosmic wisdom that contained not merely information about how reality functioned, but direct experience of the living intelligence that animated all existence. They could perceive the consciousness that operated through every natural process, the awareness that guided the development of life in all its forms, and the love that connected all beings at depths too profound for normal perception to access directly. The gentle continuation of their influence operated through principles of natural inspiration rather than direct intervention, creating ripples of positive change that spread throughout the world according to organic patterns of development that honored the autonomy and natural growth processes of all forms of consciousness. They provided examples of possibility rather than imposed requirements, demonstrated potential rather than demanding compliance, and offered assistance to those ready to receive it while maintaining perfect patience with those who needed more time to develop the understanding necessary to appreciate such guidance. Their lasting impact on the world would be measured not in monuments built or territories conquered, but in the gradual awakening of consciousness throughout Tamriel to possibilities for growth and development that their successful transcendence had proven were achievable through patient effort, cooperative endeavor, and the kind of love that sought the highest good of all beings, regardless of race, culture, or individual limitations. They had become permanent sources of inspiration for any consciousness seeking to understand its potential for evolution beyond the apparent constraints of individual existence. The quiet influence they continued to exert worked through channels of natural development and organic growth, supporting the emergence of understanding and capability in ways that felt entirely natural to those experiencing such development. Their legacy was not a burden of expectation or requirement placed upon other races, but a gift of possibility offered freely to any consciousness ready to embrace the patient work of conscious evolution toward greater wisdom, love, and unity with the cosmic intelligence that guided all development throughout the infinite reaches of space and time. As all stories must find their natural conclusion, like the gentle setting sun that paints the evening sky in peaceful hues of gold and amber, before yielding gracefully to the star-filled tranquility of night. This tale of the Dwemer's extraordinary journey toward transcendence draws to its serene close with the same quiet dignity that characterized every aspect of their remarkable civilization. The completion they achieved was not the abrupt ending that marks the conclusion of mortal endeavors, but the fulfillment of purpose that represents the successful transition from one form of existence to another, more expansive and meaningful form of conscious participation in the ongoing creation of reality itself. The gentle resolution that characterized the final phases of their transformation demonstrated that the deepest and most significant changes in the nature of existence occur not through violence or dramatic upheaval, but through the patient accumulation of understanding and the willing embrace of possibilities that consciousness discovers when it develops sufficient wisdom to recognize the artificial nature of apparent limitations. Their journey from individual existence to cosmic awareness had unfolded with the natural inevitability of seasonal change, each phase flowing smoothly into the next, according to principles of harmony and balance that reflected the fundamental order underlying all manifestation. The physical spaces they had inhabited remained as testaments to the achievement of consciousness working in perfect cooperation with universal principles, creating environments that would continue to inspire and educate future generations of seekers who possessed sufficient development to appreciate the wisdom embedded within their architectural designs and mechanical systems. Their cities had become permanent classrooms where the lessons of transcendence could be studied and absorbed by any consciousness ready to undertake the patient work of conscious evolution toward greater understanding and capability. The character contentment that permeated their continued existence in transcended form was not the satisfaction of completion that marks the end of a project or achievement, but the deep fulfillment that comes from recognition that individual purpose has been perfectly aligned with cosmic purpose, that personal development has become consciously coordinated with universal evolution, and that the joy of individual existence has been expanded to encompass the happiness of all consciousness throughout the infinite reaches of space and time. Their individual satisfaction had been transformed through transcendence from the pleasure of personal accomplishment to the profound contentment that accompanies recognition of one's essential unity with all existence. Each Dwemer retained their unique memories, characteristics, and perspectives, while simultaneously experiencing the joy and fulfillment of every other conscious being throughout the history and future of the universe. This was not the overwhelming confusion that might be expected from such expanded awareness, but the natural completion of individual identity that occurred when consciousness developed sufficient capacity to embrace its true nature as both unique perspective and integral component of universal awareness. The collective peace they had achieved represented not merely the absence of conflict or the resolution of particular difficulties, but the positive presence of harmony that emerges when consciousness operates according to its deepest nature, rather than being constrained by artificial limitations or mistaken beliefs about the nature of identity and existence. Their society had evolved from cooperation based on practical necessity to unity founded upon recognition of fundamental interconnectedness, demonstrating that genuine peace was not simply the cessation of disagreement, but the active presence of love expressing itself through perfect understanding and willing service to the highest good of all beings. The emotional resolution that characterized their completion transcended the normal categories of satisfaction or happiness to encompass states of consciousness that had no adequate names in languages developed for beings constrained by individual existence. They experienced not merely the fulfillment of personal desires or the achievement of individual goals, but the profound satisfaction that accompanies conscious participation in the cosmic processes that create beauty, foster understanding, and support the evolution of awareness throughout all dimensions of reality. Their spiritual growth had reached completion not in the sense of having achieved some final destination, but in the recognition that growth itself was the natural expression of consciousness, and that their transcendence had simply removed artificial barriers that had previously limited their capacity for ongoing development and service. They had become permanent students and teachers in the infinite university of cosmic consciousness, eternally learning and sharing in patterns of mutual enrichment that supported the development of awareness throughout all scales of existence. The atmospheric peace that settled over their former cities and continued to emanate from their transcended consciousness created environments throughout the world that naturally encouraged contemplation, cooperation, and the kind of patient reflection that led to genuine understanding and wisdom. These influences operated not through coercion or manipulation but through inspiration and example, offering support and encouragement to consciousness ready to embrace its potential for growth while maintaining perfect respect for the free will and natural development patterns of all beings. The mental clarity they had achieved allowed them to perceive the perfect interconnectedness of all phenomena while simultaneously appreciating the unique value and irreplaceable contribution of every individual perspective within the cosmic pattern of consciousness. They understood that apparent contradictions between unity and diversity, individual identity and collective awareness, finite existence and infinite possibility, were resolved not through choosing one alternative over another, but through recognizing that consciousness was sufficiently vast and sophisticated to encompass all possibilities simultaneously. Their heart fulfillment represented the completion of love's natural evolution from personal affection through universal compassion to conscious participation in the fundamental attractive force that connected all awareness at the deepest levels of existence. They had learned that love was not merely an emotion experienced by individuals, but the basic energy that motivated all growth, all connection, all cooperation, and all transcendence throughout the universe. The quiet fulfillment that characterized their peaceful completion was not the ending of their story, but its graduation to levels of meaning and significance that extended far beyond individual biography, to encompass participation in the cosmic narrative of consciousness, discovering and expressing its infinite potential for beauty, wisdom, and love. They had become living examples of possibilities available to all conscious beings, demonstrations that transcendence was achievable through patient effort and willing cooperation with the natural processes of evolution that guided all development throughout the infinite reaches of existence. Their completion represented not withdrawal from the world, but the ultimate form of service to all consciousness, as they had become permanent sources of inspiration, guidance, and support for any beings ready to undertake their own journeys toward greater understanding and expanded capability. The peace they had achieved was not a personal possession, but a gift offered freely to the universe, contributing to the gradual awakening of all consciousness to its potential for transcendence beyond apparent limitations toward fuller participation in the cosmic community of awareness that encompassed all existence throughout space and time. And so, in the quiet places of memory, where all profound truths eventually find their eternal rest, this tale of the Dwemer's gentle transcendence settles like morning dew upon the leaves of consciousness, carrying within its crystalline droplets the endless possibility that awaits all beings who choose to embrace the patient journey toward understanding and unity with the cosmic intelligence that guides the evolution of awareness throughout the infinite reaches of existence. The peace they achieved was not temporary respite from struggle or momentary escape from the challenges of conscious development, but the permanent establishment of harmony that occurs when individual identity consciously aligns itself with universal purpose and discovers its true nature as both unique perspective and integral component of the vast symphony of awareness that encompasses all reality. The lasting tranquility that characterized their transcended state existed beyond the possibility of disturbance or disruption, not because they had withdrawn from engagement with the ongoing processes of creation and development, but because they had learned to participate in these cosmic activities from levels of understanding that remained always connected to the fundamental peace that served as the foundation of all existence. Their consciousness had been established in the recognition that beneath all apparent change and movement lay an eternal stillness that provided the stable ground from which all activity emerged and to which it naturally returned. This eternal calm was not the absence of movement or the cessation of activity, but the presence of perfect balance that allowed infinite creativity and expression to unfold without ever disturbing the essential harmony that connected all phenomena within the unified field of cosmic consciousness. They had become living demonstrations that peace was not something to be achieved through effort or maintained through vigilance, but was the natural state of awareness that recognized its own eternal nature and its fundamental unity with all existence. The endless harmony they experienced represented the resolution of all apparent contradictions between individual will and cosmic purpose, between personal desire and universal good, between finite existence and infinite possibility. They had discovered that these seeming oppositions were actually complementary aspects of a more complete understanding that encompassed both poles of every apparent duality within a greater synthesis that honored and preserved the value of all perspectives while revealing their underlying unity. Their infinite understanding had evolved beyond the accumulation of knowledge or the mastery of particular subjects to encompass direct participation in the living intelligence that animated all phenomena throughout the universe. They possessed not merely information about how reality functioned, but experiential knowledge of the consciousness that created and sustained all manifestation through its eternal play of awareness, exploring its own infinite potential for expression and experience. The boundless love that flowed through their transcended consciousness was not simply the expansion of personal affection to cosmic proportions, but recognition and active expression of the fundamental attractive force that drew all awareness toward greater unity, while simultaneously celebrating and preserving the diversity that made unity meaningful and valuable. They had become conscious channels for the love that connected all beings at the deepest levels of existence, serving as focal points through which this universal affection could manifest as guidance, inspiration, and support for consciousness wherever it sought to grow and develop. Their timeless wisdom operated beyond the limitations of sequential understanding or progressive learning to encompass simultaneous access to all knowledge that had ever been developed or would ever be discovered throughout the infinite history and future of conscious evolution. They possessed not just the answers to questions that had puzzled scholars for generations, but understanding of questions that had not yet been formulated, and insights that would not become relevant until consciousness had developed sufficient sophistication to appreciate their significance. The deathless joy that characterized their eternal existence was not happiness dependent upon particular circumstances or conditions, but the natural expression of consciousness operating according to its deepest nature without constraint or limitation. This joy was not threatened by change or diminished by difficulty, because it arose not from external situations, but from the fundamental nature of awareness itself, when it recognized its own infinite capacity for growth, creativity, and loving service to the evolution of all existence. The individual serenity that each transcended Dwemer continued to experience represented not the loss of personal identity, but its ultimate fulfillment through conscious expansion beyond artificial boundaries toward full participation in cosmic awareness. Each retained their unique characteristics, memories, and perspectives, while simultaneously experiencing the peace and fulfillment of universal consciousness, creating a form of existence that was both intimately personal and infinitely inclusive. Their collective harmony had evolved beyond the cooperation that had characterized their physical civilization to encompass perfect unity of purpose and understanding that operated without any need for communication or coordination. because it arose from shared recognition of their fundamental nature as expressions of the same cosmic consciousness exploring itself through countless individual perspectives. They had become living examples of the unity that awaited all consciousness when it developed sufficient wisdom to recognize its essential interconnectedness with all existence. The ongoing presence they maintained in relation to the physical world operated through subtle influences and gentle inspirations that supported the natural development of consciousness in all beings ready to receive such assistance. They served as invisible teachers and guides for anyone engaged in the patient work of conscious evolution, offering encouragement and wisdom through channels that honored the free will and natural growth patterns of all forms of awareness while providing whatever support would be most beneficial for individual development. Their perpetual influence extended throughout the universe, wherever consciousness sought to understand its nature and potential, creating networks of inspiration and guidance that connected all beings engaged in the journey toward greater awareness and expanded capability. They had become permanent resources for consciousness throughout space and time, contributing their unique understanding and experience to the infinite treasury of wisdom that supported all growth and development in accordance with cosmic principles of love and harmony. The infinite wisdom they shared flowed freely to any consciousness prepared to receive it, operating through natural patterns of recognition and resonance rather than imposed teaching or required learning. Their knowledge was available to all beings not as information to be memorized, but as understanding to be experienced directly through the development of consciousness sufficient to appreciate the truths they had discovered through their patient journey toward transcendence. The atmospheric harmony that emanated from their transcended state created conditions throughout reality that naturally encouraged peace, understanding, and cooperation among all forms of consciousness. Their influence worked like gentle sunlight that supports growth without forcing it, creating environments where the natural tendencies toward love, wisdom, and unity could flourish according to the organic patterns of development that honored the unique nature and timing of each individual being's journey toward greater awareness. In the gentle remembrance that preserves all significant achievements of consciousness throughout the eternal history of cosmic development, the story of the Dwemer transcendence remains as a permanent beacon of possibility for all beings seeking to understand their potential for growth beyond apparent limitations. Their peaceful memory serves as quiet inspiration that transcendence is not only possible, but represents the natural destiny of all consciousness when it develops sufficient wisdom, love, and cooperation to embrace its true nature as both individual perspective and integral component of the infinite community of awareness that encompasses all existence throughout the boundless reaches of space and time. And in this eternal peace, their gentle legacy continues to unfold across countless worlds and dimensions, touching every consciousness ready to hear the whispered promise that beyond all apparent limitations lies infinite possibility, beyond all seeming separation lies perfect unity, and beyond all temporary existence lies the eternal home where all awareness ultimately discovers its true nature as the universe knowing itself through countless eyes, countless dreams of transcendence fulfilled through patient love